Lecture 13 World Communist Revolution. A lecture by Oleg Anatolievich Mazur, Red University of the Workers' Academy Fund and len.ru. Very often, comrades who are even sympathetic to the working people think that communism is only a theory, that communism is in the past, that with the destruction of the Soviet Union, communism has gone purely theoretical. In fact, it is enough to look around in the world space, and it becomes obvious that there exists a world communist system, and it is successfully developing. Let's start with the chronology of world revolutions. There were several world revolutions in the history of mankind. The first world revolution was the transition from primitive communal communist society to slave-holding society. From history, we know that ancient Egypt, the territory of China, Mesopotamia, are those countries which have begun this transition before all the others. This revolution lasted thousands of years and was completed about 10,000 years ago. Its formation, the transition period, was very, very long. The Second World Revolution was the transition from slave-holding to feudal formation. The third World Revolution was the transition from feudal to capitalist formation. The world bourgeois revolution lasted more than 3 centuries, from the 16th century to the beginning of the 20th century. One of the last bourgeois revolutions was in our country, the February Revolution of 1917. This is one of the last major bourgeois revolutions that were made on our planet. The bourgeois world revolution began in Holland. Then it came to its next stage in England. Then it has strengthened and became a world process in France. And then it started spreading, including through wars. We can say revolutionary wars. Napoleonic wars quickly enough spread this world revolution to almost the entire European continent, including a certain influence on Tsarist Russia. And it was not by chance that after the Patriotic War with Napoleon, the Decembrist revolt took place. 1917 was marked by the greatest event in world history, the world's first communist revolution. However, there had been attempts at this revolution before. The Paris Commune was the first, but it did not end in success. The first successful communist revolution was the revolution in our country in October 1917. From that moment on, mankind entered the era of transition from capitalism to communism. We have been living in this epoch for more than 100 years. Capitalism created the conditions for the transition to communism. It is possible to consider the formation system as a 5-link system: primitive communal communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, communism. And we can consider it as a 3-linked system: three-stage system: non-exploitative society, primitive communal communism; exploitative societies, slavery, feudalism, capitalism; and a return to that new level, to non-exploitative society, communism. Capitalism has created conditions for the transition to communism. What are these conditions? First of all, it is the development of productive forces. Marx clarified this truth with his titanic work embodied in Capital. Capitalism developed the productive forces of society to such an extent that the material foundations for the creation of communism were created. The means of production and the main productive force, the working class. Russia was not the most developed capitalist country, and by its political system, it was still, in fact, a feudal country. Tsarism in the Russian Empire was one of the last absolutist monarchies, but the contradictions were so aggravated that the revolution took place in Russia, not in the most developed and not in the most backward country, but in the weakest link of the world capitalist system. The weak link of capitalism was broken, and the Great October Socialist Revolution took place, which is also correctly called the Great October Soviet Communist Revolution. The capitalism of the early 20th century was monopolistic capitalism. Lenin's work, Imperialism as the Highest Stage of Capitalism, reveals a new stage in the development of capitalism. State monopolistic capitalism, which is characterized by the highest concentration of production, the emergence of monopolies, the predominance of the export of capital over the export of goods. This is no longer the capitalism of so-called free competition. It is the capitalism of monopolies merging with the state. It is the capitalism of large empires that divided the world. There have been empires before, such as the British Empire, but the capitalist empire is something else. Here, domination is not only political and military, but also economic. Most of the world, up to 90%, was divided between imperialist states: Great Britain, USA, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Japan. The world was already divided. And how could it be re-divided? By capital, by the strength of capital. German capital was getting stronger and demanded that there should be a redistribution. It was not by chance that the German Empire initiated the First World War, and it was supported by Austria-Hungary. V.I. Lenin revealed capitalism, and above all capitalism in its imperialist stage, as the eve of a revolution. Imperialism is the source of wars. This is confirmed not only by the history of the 20th century, but also by the 21st century. Imperialism is also the eve of revolution. There are no other stages between state monopolistic capitalism and communism. State monopolistic capitalism has created the conditions for the transition to communism. However, this transition is possible only through revolutionary means. Revolutions can be peaceful, although, of course, it is assumed that the masses of people will be armed. By the way, the revolution in October 1917 in Russia was quite peaceful. No one can name the victims of this revolution, while the victims of the February Revolution of 1917 are buried on the field of Mars, Марсово поле. And power was not taken so that any party would prevail, but power was immediately handed over to the Soviets, consuls, as a form of dictatorship of the proletariat. Both material conditions provided by the development of capitalism and subjective conditions were created for the revolution. The subjective conditions were the creation of a serious, disciplined, ideologically firm, having exactly Marxist-Leninist ideology, the party of the working class, the RSDLPB, which organized the revolution and the transfer of power to the Soviets. The Soviets were created earlier, and it was not the Bolsheviks who invented the Soviets, and only the Soviets of the second convocation became quite Bolshevik. Soviets, as organs of local self-government, were first established by the working class itself in Ivanovo-Voznесенsk city or town, and then in the course of the February Revolution, Soviets were established, including the very active Petrograd Soviet, St. Petersburg Soviet, in which the Bolsheviks at first did not represent a majority. The majority then belonged to the SRs and Mensheviks. It was only after the events of the summer of 1917 that the Bolsheviks increased their influence. And this was possible because the councils were formed according to the industrial principle. The Soviets were formed according to the industrial principle. The workers themselves began to recall the Mensheviks and SRs from the Petrograd Soviet and began to send Bolsheviks there, whose programs and actions were in line with the interests of the workers. By about the mid-1930s, communism in its first phase had been built in the USSR, and the Soviet Union became the first communist society. The socialist state, the state of the dictatorship of the proletariat, is designed to create communism. The nationalization of large plants and factories and banks created state ownership. In order for state property to become communist, public property, it was necessary for state property to be united into a single organism, under one umbrella, and most importantly, in the interests of the working class, because it is the working class that is objectively the exponent of the fundamental interests of all workers. This path lay through the new economic policy, NEP, or NEP. Although, if there had been no civil war, there would have been no NEP either. There would have been a peaceful, natural development from nationalized property to public ownership. The separate ownership of the peasants means of production would also have been united into cooperatives, and there would have been a gradual establishment of public ownership in the countryside. The emergence of socialism, the transitional period from capitalism to the first phase of communism, was marked by a struggle of different ways of life. What are the main ways of life characteristic of all countries in transition with different features? This is, first of all, the communist setup of economy, nationalized state property, which is already subordinated to the state of the dictatorship of the proletariat, subordinated to the interests of the working class. Then, the state setup, but which is not yet subordinated to the interests of the working class, the state capitalist system. Then, we've got the private capitalist setup, or private capitalist economic system, as part of the system, as well as the petty bourgeois setup and the patriarchal subsistence economy setup. As a result of Bolshevik policy during the transition period, the communist setup, or communist economic order, gradually replaced all the others which existed at the same time with the communist setup. A unified planning system was introduced, starting with the Go-El-Ro plan, a plan to electrify the whole country, and then 5-year plans began to be fulfilled. The establishment of communism in our country saved mankind from fascism, which might well have achieved world domination had Soviet communism not defeated German fascism and its satellites. The Soviet Union, our great ancestors, accomplished a great mission by defeating fascism. They won at the cost of enormous losses. More communists alone died on it than there were in the entire party before the war. As a result of this victory, communism became the world system. A world system, besides capitalist system. No less important events took place in Asia. The communist movement in Southeast Asia did not begin in the victorious year 1945, but in the 1920s. For about 2 decades, Chinese communists fought for the victory of the Communist Revolution. That is, even before the beginning of the period of transition from capitalism to socialism, there was a real war between the bourgeois Kuomintang government and the Red Army of the Communist Party of China, which only in 1949 ended with the success of communists. A great help and a prerequisite, a condition for the victory of the communists in China was the victory of our country in the historic battle of the Soviet Union against militarist Japan. The Soviet Union warned Japan about the termination of the Non-Aggression Pact, and in August 1945, the largest, one of the most outstanding operations in world history was carried out, as a result of which hundreds of thousands of Japanese were taken prisoner alone. And it was after this operation that Japan capitulated. The US atomic bombing of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not make Japan surrender. The establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat in China took place in a different way than in our country. In our country, it was a revolutionary coup d'etat, which literally took 2 days. In China, the struggle for the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat lasted from the 1920s to 1949. The impact of our country's victory over the Japanese militarists was very significant for the establishment and maintenance of the dictatorship of the proletariat in Korea. The Korean people defeated the powerful imperialist US and its allies and preserved their state. In Vietnam, there were wars against aggressors for decades. First against the Japanese, then against the French colonizers and against the United States. In both Korea and Vietnam, US imperialism intervened directly with its armed forces. In Vietnam, the US first supported the South Vietnamese regime in Saigon, then brought in its own troops. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers fought against Vietnam, killing millions of Vietnamese, mostly civilians. Vietnam, supported in this hard struggle by the Soviet Union and China, defended socialism. In the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, communism is in its first phase of development. In the People's Republic of China, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and the Lao People's Democratic Republic, it is still in transition from capitalism to socialism. The Republic of Cuba had to return from socialism to the transition period because of the deterioration of the economic situation, having lost support after the destruction of the USSR. Let's look at the other part of Eurasia. What was being done in the West at that time? In response to NATO, the Warsaw Pact organization was created to protect the communist system. At the same time, counter-revolutionary tendencies began to appear quite quickly in the West, already in the 40s, in Germany. But there were still unkilled fascists there, of course. But the root cause of what was happening in Hungary, East Germany, Poland in the 50s was what was happening in the Soviet Union itself. In the USSR, which won the hardest war in the world history of mankind, many of the best people died at the front, were crippled, and after Stalin's death, people like Khrushchev and his camarilla came to the fore, led the country. Does anyone know a single article that was written by Khrushchev himself and not by his assistants? This man was ideologically untrained, ideologically unstable, a trotskyte. Trotskyist. They say that the repressions were broad, but it turns out that they were not broad enough with regard to Khrushchev. They did not reach such a Trotskyist as Khrushchev. As a result of the revision of Marxism-leninism, which began quite quickly after Stalin's death, already in 1956, at the 20th Congress of the CPSU, we heard the infamous report on the personality cult of Stalin, quote-unquote. Although, what cult of personality could one talk about? Someone joked that there was a personality cult But there was also a personality. There was a personality cult, but there was also a personality. The personality. That's a joke. But that's wrong too. Yes, there were difficult moments when there should have been a certain faith, confidence in the actions of the leadership. This confidence was based on the great achievements that were won during industrialization, during the generalization of agriculture, during the communalization of agriculture, and in the Great Patriotic War. All this was rightly associated with the personality of Stalin. But to say that it was a cult of personality as such, you cannot. If it was a cult of personality, no one would have been able to quote-unquote debunk it. And if it was possible, then there was no cult of personality, but there was a cult of position, which unfortunately was taken by Khrushchev and used against socialism. It turns out that the very phenomenon of the cult of personality was created by Khrushchev and his group. And they also, quote-unquote, debunked the cult of personality. And this report, which was sort of for official use, quickly became known abroad and influenced the fact that counter-revolutionary forces became active everywhere, especially in those countries which were previously infected with fascism. In Hungary, in East Germany, in Poland, but most clearly in Hungary. There was a counter-revolutionary insurrection in Hungary. One could even say a pro-fascist insurrection, in which the insurgents quickly resorted to repression, killed communists, abused the wives of officers, beaten and killed civilians, and Khrushchev had to order the suppression of this pro-fascist insurrection. However, socialism in the Soviet Union was surprisingly strong. It took 30 years of transition period to destroy it. It was the transition period back from socialism to capitalism, which began in 1961 at the 22nd Congress, when the ruling party abandoned the guiding principle, the dictatorship of the proletariat. And not just the guiding principle, but the very state of the dictatorship of the working class. And the clear indicator of this are the events of 1962 in Novocherkassk. How could the labor power give the command to shoot a demonstration of workers who were quite rightly outraged by price increases and wage cuts? If the workers strike in a workers' state, there are two possibilities. Either the workers are wrong, and then it must be explained to them that they are wrong, and the communists must be able to do it. Or the workers are right, and then it must be done as the workers demand. In 1962, in Novocherkassk, neither of these things was done. Nobody was going to talk to the workers. The troops refused to carry out the command to shoot, but they found those people who did. And after that, they also tried those workers. They also put those workers to a trial. Those workers who were the most active among the strikers, among those who made demands. This is not the way a worker state could act, and these events show that even then the USSR was no longer no longer a state of the dictatorship of the proletariat. They were. And it was clear why the events in Czechoslovakia took place in 1968. In 1968, the counter-revolution began seemingly peacefully with the so-called Prague Spring. This spring, quote-unquote, was the consequence of the revisionist course of rejection of the dictatorship of the proletariat and of that anti-socialist reform in the economy which was carried out in the USSR in 1964-1965. The economic reform consisted, in essence, in the fact that the indicators of profitability were put forward as targets instead of the indicators of natural material and the indicator of the reduction of production costs. So the whole economy started pursuing profit. The destruction of socialism, the system of economic and social management, began already under Khrushchev, when the party organs were divided into rural and urban ones, and a return to the transition period was made in the fact that instead of a unified plant management system, sovnarkozes were recreated, thus strengthening localism, a negative phenomenon that leads to parochial mentality. People only know what's around their region and in their region and do not think state-wise. So the transition period to capitalism ended in the USSR in 1991. At the same time, China also had its own problems. We know that there were certain excesses, but this is not strange for a country that did not yet have a very large working class and did not have the traditions of the century-old labor movement. In many ways, Mao's ideas had petty bourgeois traits. There were moments of nationalist traits, but China overcame that. China is in a transitional period from capitalism to socialism nowadays. The question may arise, how can a country that has not yet built socialism be socialist? The answer is simple. A country that builds socialism is socialist. China is now in a period of transition from capitalism to socialism with its own peculiarities. The Soviet Union, instead of remaining socialist and strengthening the world communist system together with China, has itself returned to the transition period, only in the opposite direction. Mao Zedong's criticism of the CPSU's departure from the dictatorship of the proletariat and the CPSU leadership's retreat from the ideas of Marxism-leninism was absolutely correct. In terms of accumulated wealth, of course, the US is ahead of China, which is not surprising because the US is now the only imperialist center that has been appropriating huge amounts of wealth from all over the world for over 100 years. But China produces as much cement in 2 weeks as the US does in a year. And while 20 years ago China had virtually no high-speed railroads, now more than half of the high-speed railroads are Chinese roads. If China overtook the US in GDP, In purchasing power parity terms, a couple of years ago, China overtook the US in industrial output in the last decade. The tremendous development of the USSR in the 20s and the 30s, and the PRC since the 80s, all of that has shown how huge the potential of communism is. If even in the transition period from capitalism to socialism, there was a multiple growth of economy of the USSR and PRC. The population of China is 1,400,000,000 people. Vietnam has about 100 million people. The DPRK has about 25 million people. About 6 million people live in Laos, and Cuba has about 11 million people. Thus, more than 1.5 billion people live in socialism, in socialist countries. Now, of course, the main enemy of imperialism is the PRC, People's Republic of China. And the dialectic here is that the ally of the PRC is bourgeois Russia. The capitalist world is not united at all. The US does not really dominate the entire capitalist world at all. Russia, Belarus, Venezuela, and Iran are in confrontation with the imperialist center. Many countries, including India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, South Africa, Algeria, Turkey, have fairly independent policies. When they talk about the so-called quote-unquote multipolar world, it's not quite right to do. Now there are only two poles, two centers of power. One center is the decaying imperialism led by US financial capital. The second center is communist China. So, at the heart of what is happening now in the world is the struggle between these two centers of power, the two poles. At one pole is capitalism in the imperialist phase, at the other pole is communism in the stage of transition from capitalism to communism. At present, not only is the Chinese economy strengthening, while the US and the EU economies are actually stagnating, but no less importantly, the communist system in China is being strengthened due to, among other things, the confrontation with the US. It is impossible to successfully oppose imperialism if the communist setup of China's economy is not strengthened. Strengthening of the communist way of life ensures the advancement of China towards socialism, thus promoting the world communist revolution. The actual alliance with bourgeois democratic Russia, which defends its sovereignty in the struggle against fascism imposed by the US in Ukraine, also strengthens communist China. In the struggle against fascism, the bourgeois democracy in Russia is being strengthened, and this bourgeois democracy has a growing tendency to cooperate with communist China. How is Trotsky's position fundamentally different from Lenin's, since they both spoke of a world communist revolution? Lenin's position is scientific, Trotsky's is not scientific. Lenin viewed the world revolution as an epoch of violent upheavals, an epoch of upheavals, uprisings, civil wars, revolutions, and counter-revolutions. That is, the world revolution is not one revolution, but a series of revolutions, of counter-revolutions, and again, revolutions. Lenin reasoned that because of the uneven development of capitalist countries, revolution can occur in several or even in one single country. But for this to happen, the country must be large enough. The communist revolution took place in a large country, Russia, in which the aggravation of social contradictions reached the greatest degree. There was also a revolution in Hungary, but the counter-revolutionaries suppressed it. Soviet Russia was then weakened by the civil war and could not lend a helping hand. Trotsky had a different position. World revolution is a process that must proceed regardless of objective conditions of reality, regardless of the fact that first it is necessary to strengthen the revolution in one country. Trotsky believed that it was impossible to create socialism in Russia. Socialist revolutions, he said, must first be won in the most developed countries. In Germany, for example, fascist Germany. V.I. Lenin was in favor of saving the revolution in a single country, Soviet Russia. Trotsky's position was different, and it was manifested in practice during the negotiations on the Brest Peace. He was entrusted by the party to conduct these negotiations, to lead a delegation to Brest-Litovsk, and he stopped the negotiations and gave a command to the headquarters to demobilize the army. Trotsky, who headed the Soviet peace delegation, believed that in Brest-Litovsk he should make a statement. We do not sign the peace, we stop the war, demobilize the army. The position of the left communists, so-called left communists, as well as Trotsky's position, stemmed from disbelief in the strength of the working class of Russia, from disbelief in the possibility of the victory of the socialist revolution in the country, and jeopardized the gains of the October Revolution. A number of party workers, carried away by leftist revolutionary phrases, also advocated the termination of peace negotiations and the declaration of revolutionary war on Germany. An extremely difficult situation had been created in the party. It took Lenin's greatest stamina and firmness to prove to the party cadres, the party people, the necessity of accepting hard peace terms to win a respite. Lenin explained that the preservation of the Soviet Republic was most important for the working class of Russia and for the unfolding of the world socialist revolution. Self-check questions. What world revolutions have there been in history? What conditions are necessary for a successful revolution? What are the socialist countries in the world now? Describe their political economic situation. Which ones are in transition period? Which country has built socialism? How did Lenin's position differ from Trotsky's on the issue of world revolution? End of lecture. Thank you and bye-bye. I hope this was useful. See ya.